And we will start in 5 seconds. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this town hall entitled Nevada County's Economy and COVID-19. We are very fortunate that the County of Nevada, the City of Grass Valley, the City of Nevada City, the Town of Truckee, Sierra Business Council, and the Economic Resource Council are sponsoring this event, and the featured panelist will be introduced by our Nevada County CEO, Allison Lehman.
Great, thank you, Pascal. It's my pleasure to welcome John Halfman to Nevada County. He's the Executive Director of the National Economic Education Delegation, which is an independent and nonpartisan nonprofit promoting fact-based discourse and evidence-based policy. John is dedicated to economic literacy so that regular citizens can know how to spot the difference between out and outright nonsense and the consensus opinions among experts. Dr. Halfman holds a PhD in the Masters of Science in Economics from the University of Michigan and a Bachelor's of Science in the Economics of the University of Wisconsin. He has served the director for the economics programs at the Public Policy Institute of California, and he has served with the President's Council of Economic Advisors and with the Federal Trade Commission, and he's held a faculty position in the business school at Purdue University. Tonight, he'll talk about the national and local economic impact of coronavirus, and he'll share with us his thoughts on how the economy is doing, how rapidly we are opening back up, and forecasts of the path forward. And he'll address the local economic impact and what the new few next months might bring to Nevada County. So the speech that he gave earlier in Sacramento last May, which led to his invitation here, we look forward to hearing his thoughts about how a rural community like ours can rebound to create greater resiliency and sustainability. So the County of Nevada is proud to co-sponsor this event with the City of Grass Valley, the City of Nevada City, the Town of Truckee, Sierra Business Council, and the Economic Resource Council. And Pascal, I really want to appreciate and thank you for facilitating this from Ubinet, who's producing the event tonight. Thanks, Pascal.
Most welcome. John, up to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Allison. Thanks for inviting me to be here tonight. It's a pleasure. We are in a period of unique challenges, and I'll go through a bunch of those. Let me get my screen shared here. Okay. So as Allison indicated, I am the Executive Director of the National Economic Education Delegation. Allison gave a very nice intro, and my mouse seems to have gotten stuck on me. Oh, that's all right. So thank you for that. And so I won't spend very much time talking about need, other than to emphasize that we try to be aggressively nonpartisan, and we are comprised of about 600 PhD, largely academic economists. Economists ranging from former Fed chairs Janet Yellen and Ben Bernanke to 6 former chairs of the Council of Economic Advisors under both Democrat and Republican presidents. Finally, we have 3 Nobel Prize winners on our honorary board as well. And then there are 500 plus members of the delegation. And we have some global partners as well. These are PhD economists all over the world who think that this is a good idea. It needs mission to get out and tell people what we, the economists and the economics profession know about economic policy issues is a responsibility that we've actually been shirking for a very long time. So NEED has been around for about 2.5 years. We have given more than 250 talks to more than 13,000 people. So I think we're off to a pretty good start. I want to invite anybody who is online, if you're a member of an organization, perhaps Rotary, Kiwani, retirement community, or high school, who would like to bring in a NEED delegate to talk on any of the following topics, I'd be delighted to hear from you. Okay, so that's enough about me and enough about NEED. Let's get into coronavirus economics, right? So all of our slide decks at NEED are co-authored by members of the delegation. And this one was written by myself and Scott Bayer, the chair of the economics department at Clemson University, and Jeffrey Woglum, retired from Amherst College. So what am I going to talk about tonight? I'm going to talk about 5 things. The first is I'm going to talk a little bit about what is this, right? And that seems a question to which the answer is self-evident. But I'm going to frame it a little bit differently in a way that may help frame the talk a little bit better. I'm going to provide some evidence of the impact on the economy, both Nevada County and the nation as a whole, a little bit on California as well. We'll talk about government policy. What has the government done to date? And how good a job do I think it's done? And then we will look a little bit at the path forward. There are a bunch of forecasts out there, and we'll talk about those forecasts and what the next 6 months to a year might bring. And then we will talk more specifically about Nevada County. I think that, just a spoiler alert, I think that Nevada County is in for a great deal of financial difficulty, but there is lemonade to be made out of the lemons, and I'll talk about what that is when we get there. Okay, so first the question of what is this? All right, well, when I think about this sort of conceptually, I think about it as a natural disaster. And that's helpful, I think, for thinking about the policies that we're going to implement. It's a natural disaster like a flood, like a fire, like an earthquake, like a hurricane, but it has some important little twists, right? The first is that it's global. It's affecting everybody. And that at the same time makes it easier to respond and harder to respond. Governments all over the world are competing at some level for resources to do battle with the natural disaster. Second is that its duration is unpredictable. If you think about a flood, if you think about a fire, if you think about a hurricane or an earthquake, we know that they're going to be over in a relatively finite period of time. The rebuilding will take a long time, but the actual event will be over in a relatively finite period of time. That's not true with the pandemic. We don't know. And what's more is that the duration of the pandemic is, to some extent, under our control. And we'll talk about how well the United States as a whole has been dealing with the pandemic. And finally, its economic toll is simply enormous, and it's potentially durable. We're going to see a lot of bankruptcies, a lot of liquidations, a lot of companies are not going to survive this, and that will be a long-term toll. In fact, the Congressional Budget Office has projected that we won't be back to where we otherwise would have been economically until about 2029. Right? So this thing is probably going to take a decade to fully wring itself out, economically speaking. Now, from the point of view of the virus and combating that, I'm very hopeful that it won't take nearly that long. I think that the possibility of a vaccine by the end of this year, that may be optimistic, but even if that happens, it will be some time before logistically we can get everybody inoculated. So it's a natural disaster. It's a health crisis that has spilled over onto the economy. It's kind of the perfect storm of economic difficulty. We usually think of recessions as being started from 3 different places, or from one of 3 different places, right? One is supply side. I'm guessing that many of us on here tonight can remember back to the oil crises of the 1970s and early 1980s, right? When the supply of oil was restricted and price went up and the economy went into a recession. That's a supply side. And demand side, we experienced a bad demand side recession just about 10 years ago, right? In the early aughts, 2000s, home prices were skyrocketing. We had a massive housing bubble. Everybody was pulling money out of their house, using their home as an ATM and buying stuff. Right? And that buoyed the economy until the housing market crashed, and then everybody stopped. That did bleed over into the financial sector side, right? When the financial sector gets into it, then liquidity becomes an issue, lending becomes an issue, and access to cash becomes an issue, and the economy sort of grinds to a little bit of a halt. This time we're experiencing all 3 of those, right? The supply side from China, our relationships there, and demand side, we told everybody to stay at home. And it's hard to spend money when you have to stay at home, though we seem to be doing a reasonably good job of it. And then the financial sector, lots of the stock market started tanking, and that had implications that we'll talk about. Finally, in terms of what is this, right? It's an event without a culprit, which is actually really great from the perspective of dealing with the recession and the economic impact. And that's because we don't have one side of the political aisle saying, oh, Wall Street, this is your fault, so we can't help you. And we don't have the other side of the aisle saying, oh, homeowners, you should have known better, so we won't help you. And there's no culprit. Everybody is in this together. And so we got government action really, really quickly. And I'll talk a little bit about the importance of that. Okay, so that's the what is this. Let's move on to the impact on the economy. Right, so this graph is a depiction of what's happened to consumer spending in the United States. Right, so over here on the left-hand side, right, this line is sort of zigzagging around zero. Right, we put it at zero because zero is what spending was in early January, and deviations from that are deviations from spending in January. Right, so January, much of February into March, right, things dipped a little bit and it kind of came back up. And then we started hearing, this is roughly where we heard about Italy and Iran. We started realizing that, oh, this is going to be a big deal. And long before shelter-in-place orders were in place, people started staying home and stopped spending. So spending declined precipitously, about 33%. Now, spending is about 70% of what drives the economy. So if you knock 30% off of that, it's an enormous hit, right? Another interesting aspect of this graph, at least I find it interesting, is that we only really stayed shelter in place for about 3 weeks. Right after about 3 weeks' time, we started creeping out, spending more. I'll show you data on driving directions requests that indicate that we started coming out after about 3 weeks under. So we've been coming out, and we peaked a couple of weeks ago, and there appears to be a retrenchment, right? Which isn't at all surprising because the number of cases have been rising rapidly over the course of the last couple of weeks, and stores that were open are being shut back down. So the economic difficulty, we're not out of the soup just yet. So that's what happened to spending, and that's the driver of what's going on in the economy. And over here in this chart, we've got total non-farm payrolls. And this tells you what happened in any given month from January of 2006 through June of this year. Right, the orange bar is going down, that's when labor declined, and the blue bar is going up, that's when jobs increased. Right, so this over here is what happened during the global financial crisis of 10 years ago. Right, and I think we all thought that was horrible. Right, at its peak, we were losing about 750,000 jobs in a month. Right, and we ramped up to that kind of slowly. We ramped up to it and experienced it for a little while, and then it went away. And then we've had this recovery where 10 to 13 years of 10 years worth of job gains, and then all of a sudden in March we lost about 1.5 million jobs, and then in April we lost another 20.8 million jobs. Jobs have been coming back, about 2.8 million in May, and then another 4.8 million in June, but we are still down about 15 million jobs. We started coming back, but there's a long way to go. Okay. We can look at unemployment. We can see that the unemployment rate peaked 2 months ago at about 14.7%. It's now coming down. I think that these estimates, however, do not fully encapsulate the different degree of difficulty that's being experienced, partly because the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the government agency that records and reports these numbers, has indicated that it perhaps is underreporting unemployment. It took a bunch of people that got furloughed and classified them as being on vacation, unpaid vacation. If we take those folks and we add them back in, then the April unemployment rate was about 20%, and the May unemployment rate was about 16%. Probably still another decline going into June, but much higher than was actually reported. And there are also an enormous number of people who wouldn't be classified as unemployed because they're working part-time rather than full-time, which they were before the coronavirus. And partly because a bunch of people are sitting on the sidelines not looking for work, and they're classified as out of the labor force. Right? If we include them, then the unemployment rate may well be as high as it was during the Great Depression, about 25%. Now, I'm not for a second saying that the economic harm is going to last and be deep for 10 to 12 years. But we peaked out pretty close to where we were during the Great Depression. Okay. One of the first bits of data to start coming out was initial unemployment claims. So this graph is telling you how many people in a given week applied for unemployment insurance for the first time, right? And so we go along here. The steady state is somewhere around 200,000 to 300,000 jobs, people applying for unemployment insurance in a given week. And then we hit the coronavirus, and it ramped right up in 2 weeks to about 6.8 million people requesting unemployment insurance. So that number is 6.8. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. right? So that's the 6.8 million people applied for unemployment insurance in basically the second week of this crisis. Now we can go back here and look at what was going on during the global financial crisis again. And in the worst month, there were 665,000 people applying for unemployment insurance, right? 10 times that at the worst week during the current crisis, right? Now those numbers have come down. There are some reporters out there that I want to admonish because I read a lot of reports that say, oh, these numbers are coming down, so things are getting better. It really doesn't mean that things are getting better. It means perhaps that they're getting worse at a slower rate, right? Just today, it was reported that 1.3 million people applied for unemployment insurance for the first time last week. Right? So the unemployment is 40 plus million new claims since the end of March. Unemployment rate should be up around 20 to 22% if it's calculated correctly. What I prefer to look at is continuing unemployment claims. These are how many people are receiving unemployment in a given week. You can see that before this, it was about 1.7 million. And then it ramped right up to about 25 million people receiving unemployment at the peak. That number's come down a little bit, down around 18 million people. It's come down, it's coming down very slowly, which is suggestive that things are getting better, but they're getting better at a very slow rate, and they're still extremely elevated. All right, so the economy, despite all of the opening that's been going on, the economy and people is still struggling, and lots of people are still out of work. In Nevada County, we can look at initial claims and continuing claims. These are the data that EDD puts out for each month in 2020. Right back here in January, the blue bar is initial claims. So there were 524 people who in Nevada County applied for unemployment insurance in January, and 824 people were receiving unemployment. February was much the same. And then March, all of a sudden, here we go, shelter in place. People stopped going out to restaurants, 4.5 million people. We went up almost tenfold from the January level, more than tenfold from the February level. And here we've still got a low number of people receiving unemployment because this is basically the numbers from the week ending March 12th, right? All of these are the week ending the 12th of that month. So in April, that's when we get this continuing claims number of around 6.7 million and initial claims around 5 million, right? So you add these two together and you're at about 10 million. There were about 11 million non-farm jobs lost in Nevada County, and there were about 13 million jobs lost, including the farm jobs. Right, so we've got the vast majority of folks who lost their jobs applying for unemployment insurance. We'll probably never quite get up there because some of these folks were probably working more than one job. So that's the picture in Nevada County. It's unfortunate that April is the last month. April was probably the worst month, so this number might go down just a little bit in May and June, but in June it might have ticked back up a little bit because things started getting worse again. Okay, so that's Nevada. We can look at the stock market a little bit. This is the Dow Jones is the blue line, and the S&P 500 is the red line. This is back in January, and here everything's normalized to 100. So again, deviations from this are deviations from what we experienced in January. In the stock market, right here, this little dip, this is when we heard about this coronavirus thing that's happening over in China. And we thought, oh, well, it's happening in China, it'll stay in China. So the stock market decided to largely ignore it and kept going up until February 19. And again, that's roughly when we heard about Iran and Italy. Things started getting bad, the stock market started tanking. And this, March 3, that is where the Federal Reserve first intervened. They lowered interest rates very aggressively. Markets thought, okay, well, Federal Reserve's got our back. We're gonna think everything's gonna be okay. But then we started hearing March Madness, the college basketball tournament, the NBA rest of the season and the finals canceled, Major League Baseball, Coachella Valley, lots of cancellations. And oh my goodness, things are gonna be horrible. And the stock market fell 35% in the span of just 1 month. This right here, the trough, that's where the CARES Act was passed, right? The $2.2 trillion spending package by Congress. And that really sent a loud message to the markets that, well, okay, it's not only the Federal Reserve, but the entire government is looking out for the economy and things are going to bounce back pretty quickly. So the stock market bounced back pretty quickly. All right, here, the S&P was just about back up to its January level. I think we're going to see a bunch of more time where the stock market is below where it was in January, and it's going to go in fits and starts. There's going to be good news that the stock market's going to overreact to, and there's going to be bad news that the stock market overreacts to. One question that I often get is, well, why is the stock market doing this when the economy is so bad? I don't know if, so Kai Ryssdal and NPR keep saying the stock market is not the economy. And he's very right, because the stocks are intended to reflect the lifetime value of companies, right? And just because they're experiencing a downturn now doesn't mean that their future prospects are dimmed, right? It just means that their prospects for the next year or a couple of years are dimmed, and they'll likely bounce back. So we shouldn't expect a 35% decline, and a 10% decline is something much more along the lines of what's reasonable. The stock market has a tendency, especially over the course of the last several years, to significantly overreact to both good and bad news. Okay, so let's turn a little bit to policies. There have been three types of policies. There's been the social policy that's been imposed by government. That's the social distancing and the shelter in place. There's fiscal policy, a ton of spending by Congress, and then monetary policy, a lot of interest rate lowering and provision of liquidity. We'll talk more about each of these. In terms of the social distancing, I want to talk a little bit about, we don't hear it much very often, but a couple of months ago, everybody's asking the question, well, is the cure worse than the disease? Is sheltering in place doing more damage than the benefits that we receive from it? And I'll start out by saying that economists are pretty much uniformly of the view that no, what we're doing is the right thing. And let me go through a little exercise to explain why. So this red hump here is intended to reflect an abstract number of cases on a daily basis. If we don't have protective measures, if we don't shelter in place, if we don't social distance, then cases are going to ramp up pretty quickly because everybody's getting sick. It's going to reach a pretty high level up here, and then it's going to come down quickly because either everybody's had it, or we reach herd immunity, and the thing gets over with, maybe relatively quickly. Right? The problem with allowing it to run its course is that we have some capacity constraints in our healthcare system, right? If our current healthcare is here, then all these folks who got sick in excess of the healthcare capacity, right? Their chances of death have gone up enormously. Right, so what we want to do, and we don't talk about it very much anymore because we're not doing it very well, I think, is flatten the curve. We want to push down on this top piece. We want to push it down so the curve looks something more like this. Right, so the number of cases ramps up more slowly. It peaks at a much lower level, but it continues on for a much longer period of time. Right, a lot of people that I talk to think that we've sheltered in place in order to get through this more quickly, and that's actually not the case. We're prolonging the damage, right? For those of you who are looking carefully, you'll note that I didn't put the peak of this below our healthcare capacity constraint, right? And that's because in addition to pushing down the peak, we've pushed it out in time. So we've bought ourselves some time where ostensibly we could be increasing our healthcare capacity. Now it's not entirely clear that we have done that to the extent that perhaps we should, but that's a conversation perhaps another day. Right, so, okay, so we flattened the curve and we saved a lot of lives, but there's a big impact on the economy. Well, if we don't do anything, there's still going to be an impact on the economy. And that's going to look something like this. The economy is going to slow and it's going to reach a trough around here, and then it's going to come back pretty quickly, right? When nobody's getting sick anymore, then the economy is going to be just fine, right? So that's without protective measures. When we implement the protective measures, as we all know, the economy tanks pretty quickly, and it's going to trough at a much lower level. Then it's going to continue out in time much longer than it otherwise would have, both because the cases are getting pushed out in time and because there's a psychological hangover, right? Even my co-author, Scott Bayer from Clemson University, he loves his football. He went to the national championship game. Even he says, come September, I'm not sure I'm going to be willing to share my Saturday afternoon with 80,000 of my closest friends. Right, so even if the politicians came out tomorrow and said everything is fine, go on about your business, a lot of people really wouldn't. And there's a lot of evidence from in particular restaurant data that people started sheltering in place and stopped going out well before the politicians said that we should. Right, so people are going to be driven by their own instincts, and that's going to cause a lot of people to shelter in place longer than politicians think is maybe necessary. Okay, so we saved a bunch of lives, but we did damage to the economy. Now, how in the world do we figure out whether or not it was worth it? Well, this is the economist's bailiwick. This is one of the key policy analysis tools in our toolbox, and that is the cost-benefit analysis, right? You figure out what's the benefit of doing something, and you figure out what's the cost of doing something. And if the benefit is bigger than the cost, well, then it's a good idea. Okay, so we can do sort of a back of the envelope calculation. How much should we value all of those lives that we saved? Well, we can value them by estimating how many lives were saved, right? And estimates range from 200,000 up to 2 million. So we took an estimate on the low end, about 600,000 lives, assume we saved 600,000 lives. And each of those lives is valued maybe at $7 million. Right? This is something that economists and actuaries and lawyers are pretty comfortable doing, is putting a value on life. There's a small cottage industry in the economics profession that does it, and they estimate that the value of a life, the value of a statistical life, nobody in particular's life, is somewhere between 5 and 14 million. Right, so we took a number that was on the low side again, so we multiplied that low number by that low number, and we got this massive number over here. Right, so we're estimating the benefits of lives saved at about 4.2 trillion. And there are massive long-term health issues that could happen. Maybe we save 2 million of those. Long-term respiratory disorder, and some heart disease, I believe. So 2 million of those, we value those each at $500,000. That's another $1 trillion. So from an economist's perspective, the benefits of social distancing are about $5.2 trillion, right? That's a lot, but what we got to look at the costs. What are the costs of this? And the costs are foregone economic activity, right? The costs of shelter in place, of lockdown, of the fact that people aren't spending money the way that they had been. And this is really complicated. I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to assert, right, that it lasts about a quarter, and we lost about 70 plus work days in a quarter for the entire economy. And if you do that multiplication, you find out that that cost is about $1.3 trillion. Now, it could well be that the coronavirus is going to last twice as long as is included in this estimate. Then we're up around $2.6 trillion. Well, 2.6 trillion is still much less than 5.2 trillion. And it really doesn't take an economist to tell you that if you can pay $1.3 trillion for something that's worth $5.2 trillion, you probably ought to do it all the time, right? And this is the benefit of the cure, and this is the cost of the cure. The benefit far exceeds the cost. So we're doing the right thing against, again, rare moment of unanimity in the economics profession. Right, from a fiscal policy timeline perspective, this is I call social insurance and not stimulus, because it's not designed to get people out spending money. It's designed to get people to stay home through paid sick leave. It's designed to get people to have the money to spend in the event that they need it for food, for shelter, for clothing, what have you, but not designed to stimulate the economy. And here's kind of the timeline of the spending. I won't go through all of it. But there's about $3 trillion worth of spending in here. Now, a bunch of it in the Paycheck Protection Program will come back as it's declared loans. So it's going to be somewhat less than $3 trillion, but it's still, I'll call it adult money. It's a lot of money that's sloshing around here. We've got, money for public health, medical supplies early on. We paid sick leave for a bunch of folks. That was important because a lot of low-income workers didn't have paid sick leave, and if they didn't go to work, they would lose their job, right? So they went to work while being sick and spread the disease. Better they should stay home. So we facilitated that. Household payments of $1,200, support for small firms and medium-sized firms, $600 increment to unemployment insurance, and some aid to states, but not nearly enough yet. And then this was sort of a booster plan. Added more money to the Paycheck Protection Program, COVID-19 testing, and to hospitals. Right, so that's about somewhere between $2 and $3 trillion worth of spending. And that increase has so far increased the deficit for 2020 relative to 2019 by about $2 trillion. Right? It's going to increase it more, but that sort of begs the question, oh my gosh, how do we pay for all of this? Right? Well, we pay for it by borrowing from the future. Right? We're selling more government treasuries. And it turns out that we can accommodate that by the Federal Reserve essentially creating money. And we're borrowing it at a price. Fortunately, the interest rates are near zero. Right? We all know that if you can borrow at zero, it's a much better idea than if you have to pay a higher interest rate. So that's the good news. The bad news is that the long-term budget outlook was already a mess going into this, right? This is the CBO. This is the national debt as a share of GDP. Relative to GDP, and national debt in World War II was a little bit bigger than GDP. Before this happened, we were at about 80% of GDP. Now we're at about 100%. And it was forecast we were going to get up to 180% of GDP. Now we're closer to 200, 220% of GDP, right? So our long-term budget outlook was a mess, right? But we're mostly in California, so we'll get the analogy, right? If your house is on fire, you don't worry about the fact that you're in a drought. You just put it out and you worry about it tomorrow. Well, our economic house is on fire, and so we desperately need to put it out. We're doing the right thing. Again, more unanimity, shocking, I know, but more unanimity in the economics profession. Okay, look at monetary policy. This is designed to stabilize the economy and maintain the liquidity of the system. Actions took three forms. One is lowering their interest rates so people borrow more freely. The other is to inject cash in the system by buying the treasuries that the federal government needs to float. And the third is to shore up debt and structures. The Federal Reserve is basically pledged to shore up any debt, even local government debt. They're willing to buy it to help shore up the economy and keep the economy going. I sort of classify their actions as being heroic. Jerome Powell took Ben Bernanke's playbook, added some more of his own. He's doing a pretty good job. We can find we can see the Federal Reserve timeline, and I won't go into this at all because they're very detailed and would take a long time. I just wanted it to be in here for anybody who might want to download the slide deck, which will be on my website after the talk. So there's the timeline, and it's kind of fun. We can see Fed policy in action. So this line, this orange line here, that is the interest rate on the 10-year government treasury. As the stock market tanked, people pulled their money out of the stock market and bought treasuries. When demand goes up for treasuries, the interest rate goes down, right? So they're pushing down the interest rate, and then everybody realized, oh my gosh, I'm not going to have any revenue because nobody's spending money. So they entered in a cash grab, pulled the money out of treasuries, and then the Federal Reserve said, "Oh, it's all right, it's all right. We're gonna back your loans." So everybody put their money back into treasuries, and the interest rates are back down at about 0.65%, 0.6% on long-term treasuries. That is a historically low number. Okay, thoughts on policies to date? Well, the costs are enormous, $2 to $3 trillion, and the Federal Reserve is injecting upwards of $4 trillion worth of liquidity, but we're doing it very quickly, which has been very important. I see evidence of that in the NASDAQ, right? So the blue line is what happened to the NASDAQ in the wake of the global financial crisis. And the maroon line here, that's what the NASDAQ has done since February 19, when it peaked this year. Well, the first time it peaked this year, the NASDAQ went down very fast. Got lots of government activity, and NASDAQ has bounced back. It's also true that a lot of tech companies, Amazon in particular, Zoom, are doing very well through the coronavirus. So the NASDAQ is in fact 7% above its peak in February, which is remarkable. It took 500 days for the NASDAQ to reach its trough because government policy wasn't really forthcoming during this period. So it took 500 days for the NASDAQ to reach its trough and then start to recover. Right, this time is different. Monetary policy, I mentioned, I think it was heroic, given an A+. Fiscal policy, it was done very quickly. It had to be done quickly, and I'll give them credit for doing it quickly, but that said, I don't think they've done it very well. If we had more time, we could talk about Denmark's program for maintaining the ties between employers and employees. I think a lot of folks who got the $1,200 check didn't arguably need it. They still had their job. So we're spending a lot of money and doling it out to a lot of people. In fact, I have a friend who was a CEO of a financial services company, and they got a $600,000 loan. They ended up giving it back because they didn't really need it, but a lot of money has gone to corporations that have taken it and then are holding on to it. And they got it primarily because they had a good relationship with their bank, right? And also there is far too little in there for states and local governments who are going to be hit really, really badly. How badly? Well, in 2021, so this is the hit that state and local governments took, the deficits that were run during the 2001 recession. Here we are during the Great Recession. The worst year was $230 billion. During COVID-19, it's projected, and these are old numbers, so this number is going to be bigger, Those numbers aren't getting any bigger. These numbers are getting bigger because we're doing so badly. But 290, that's significantly worse than it was during the Great Recession. California, I think they're going to have to revise this number. This may be a month and a half old now. California's budget shortfall is going to be in excess of $54 billion. And California was in pretty good shape going into this, but still not good enough to deal with that kind of a deficit. So they're going to need help from the federal government, which has the capacity to run deficits and to borrow, which state and local governments do not. Right? Okay, lots of inequities. I don't want to talk very much about this because of time, but there are lots of data on how minority communities are getting hit worse and the death rates are much higher. Those of us with good jobs that we can telecommute from, we are maintaining our jobs, and it's been primarily low-wage jobs that are at risk. 40% of the jobs that have been lost paid less than $40,000 a year. And those folks didn't have much in the way of financial resources to begin with. It was estimated that before all this started, 40% of all households could not weather a $400 financial emergency. $400, and this is much bigger than $400. Then educational inequities, because broadband is not ubiquitous. Kids like my son, they didn't skip a beat, he just went online. But many of his friends, about 40% of his classmates, are in local income families that don't have Wi-Fi. So they were already behind the 8 ball educationally, and this has done them a little bit more damage. So what does the future bring? Well, it depends on our ability to harness the virus, and I'll show you in a minute that we don't seem to have any ability in that direction right now. Depends ultimately on the ties between employers and employees. How easy is it for employers to get their employees back? We're going to have further government policy. I sincerely hope, because we need it. We need more aid to the vulnerable. The enhanced unemployment benefits run out at the end of this month. The PPP was intended to last for 2.5 months. It's now been 3. We need aid to state and local governments, as I was saying, and ultimately stimulus to get the economy going, but not yet. We don't know what kind of stimulus to offer, and we don't want to push people out any more than they already are. Going to be big structural changes in the economy. There's going to be lots more telecommuting, lots more telehealth. I tell you, if I never have to go and sit in my doctor's office waiting room for 45 minutes to an hour, I'll be a happy man. Those are both productivity enhancing. Telecommuting, I think, is particularly important for Nevada County, and I'll mention that in a minute. More rapid adoption of technology, because people will want technology, companies will want technology instead of workers to insulate them from this kind of thing happening again, which it likely will. And I think that buying from Amazon is changing the way that we're buying things. I think the brick and mortar retail is going to take a gut punch from which it will never recover. It may just be hastening the inevitable, but we're going to see a dramatic decline in retail outlets as we come out of this. That's part of what I expect. Here are forecasts. Growth projections are kind of all over the place. Economists rely on history and intuition to do these forecasts. We have no history for this kind of thing, so this is mostly intuition, and intuition varies significantly amongst economists. This is the Anderson forecast down at UCLA at -8.6. This is Morningstar, the Congressional Budget Office, down in the 5% range. So somewhere between probably 5% and 9% is what we're going to experience in a decline for 2020. It could in fact be bigger than that because the news is trending badly. These are significantly revised down. The IMF a month ago was, I think, at 5.6%. Right, so things could get worse in terms of forecast before they get better. There's a general consensus that we will be seeing economic growth in 2021, and I don't at all disagree with that. It will not be growth significant to return us to where we were at the beginning of this year. That won't happen until late 2022 or perhaps 2023. And again, a recovery of where we would have been. Right? The economy would have kept growing throughout the 20s, and we won't catch up. We won't catch back up until 2029. Okay, I've been talking about how we aren't managing this very well. It looked like we had gotten a handle on it, and cases were starting to come down. And then it's like everybody just decided, oh, well, things are fine. Let's go back out, and cases have ramped up. And I think nationwide, 5 of the last 9 days, we have experienced record numbers of cases. It is among a younger cohort, so deaths are not likely to ramp up quite as quickly as cases, so that's the upside. It's pretty uniform across the United States. It's kind of remarkable. Here I've got all of the states in which cases have increased significantly over the course of the last 14 days. And one of the criteria for opening up is supposed to be that you have declines in cases over a 14-day period, right? So none of these states should be in the least bit opening up according to the recommendations. 38 out of 50, probably 51, because we've got the Virgin Islands in there. I imagine Puerto Rico is too, so 52. Right, so dramatic increases. California, we're not doing very well. Florida is doing horribly. And Georgia's not doing well. Louisiana, things are bad all across the country. I think we need to buckle in and really deal with this. And that means closing down more shops. That means wearing masks, right? Without masks, everything else we do just doesn't matter. Masks are the first line of defense, and they sort of make everything else that we do much more effective, right? Turning to deaths, right? We haven't seen the uptick in deaths because deaths kind of trail cases by about a month. And we are about a month from where it started, and we're starting to see an uptick in deaths. So the next couple of weeks, I think, are going to give us some pretty bad data in terms of deaths nationwide. In terms of opening up, just more evidence of how much we've opened up. This is data from Homebase. They collect data from small businesses that pay their workers hourly. And if we look in particular at the beauty and personal care industry, that's haircuts and nail salons and what have you, they were down 93% of their hours worked at the trough. And that was about April 10, right? Since April 10, we've been reopening steadily. So now they're still down 44%, but they're more than halfway back. Every other industry is also exhibiting substantial return to normal. Right, even leisure and entertainment, that's come back very significantly, 20% relative to the 80% that they were down. Right, so we're opening up at a pretty rapid pace, and I think we're paying the price for it. You can see these are the driving direction requests that I promised early on. This is from Apple, and basically they're just counting the number of times that people request driving directions as a proxy for how much we're opening up. Now, people may just not be going to their local places. They may be going and exploring places they haven't otherwise. And so driving requests may be higher. But we're seeing that this is January. And we see that the orange line is the United States, the green is California, and red is the San Francisco Bay Area. Right? We see that driving direction requests were increasing. They increased about 20% in California. Through early March, and then we started sheltering in place, and it fell off a cliff to about half of what it was, right? And that lasted, again, about 3 weeks until about April 10, and everybody said, oh, well, we flattened the curve, let's go right back on out, right? So now nationwide, about 40% of where it was in January. California, about 12, 13%. And in the San Francisco Bay Area, still below where it was in January, but climbing until the last week or so. And we start to see these driving direction requests are going back down as people start to hunker back down to deal with the I won't say second wave, because we never got out of the first, right? This is just an acceleration of the first wave. So that's what's going on nationwide. And it's not this simple, shutting down and opening back up. Georgia learned that, right? They opened back up. This is consumer spending, much like what we looked at on the first slide, right? They opened up here and didn't see any bump in consumer spending for the next couple of weeks, right? That's the psychological hangover that I mentioned. You can open up all you want, but you got to convince people that cases are going down and it's safe. And if people aren't convinced it's safe, they're not going to go out, right? So I think even though our lots of state and local governments around the country are saying it's okay, a lot of people are saying, well, no, I don't think it is, and they're staying at home. All right, so let's zoom in to Nevada just a little bit, Nevada County. This is the Nevada County dashboard, which I think is terrific. It shows over here the daily number of cases. This looks like, we could call it a second wave in Nevada County, because it was gone largely in May, no new cases. And Nevada County, as with the rest of the United States, starting to ramp up in cases as people head out the door and start trying to resume activity as normal. It's not working. What about employment in Nevada County? We've only got data up through May. I wish we had June. So this blue line, this is trends in employment growth in Nevada County until we hit March and fell off a cliff, right? So again, it's normalized to 100. So it dropped down to 73.9, which means that it's about 26% off its peak, off its pre-COVID level. I guess the peak was back here in the housing boom, right? So it's about 26% below where it was. We can look at unemployment, right? Nevada County, experiencing unemployment that's sort of intermediate between California and the United States at about 15.9% in May, right? So that's a big number. And I'll be interested to see when the June numbers come out. Hopefully employment ticks up a little bit and hopefully the unemployment rate ticks down a little bit. Thinking about individual industries, sectors of the economy, total non-farm, these are slightly different data. So instead of getting the 26% number, we're talking about non-farm and not total employment. So non-farm data down almost a third in the county. Trade, transportation, utilities down a little closer to a third. Education and health, retail trade down 35%. Leisure and hospitality, right? That's the one that really took it on the chin. Manufacturing lost a lot of jobs too, but it wasn't that big to begin with. Leisure and hospitality, this is where the rubber is really sort of hitting the road for the county. And that's tourism. People just aren't going out and about the way that they did. So Nevada County has been and will continue to pay a significant price for its reliance on the tourism sector. So those are employment changes by sector. Implications for the county are many. It is economically disadvantaged relative to other reasons, largely because of its reliance on tourism. So that's going to be down, and it's going to be down for a while. I think it's going to be quite some time before it really picks up back to normal, and longer than for many other places that have more of an emphasis on providing essential goods. Local revenues will be significantly depressed, likely for several years, but hopefully federal government help will come in. And I could honestly see revenues being depressed in Nevada County out through 2024. So there'll be lots of struggles there. Potential outmigration, right? As the county struggles to come back, there will be jobs available in other nearby regions to those who live in the county and may well leave. If not, their residents may take their employment elsewhere. But I do want to end on kind of a bright note. I think that there is an enormous opportunity for Nevada County, and that's largely driven by the real estate market. Right, so over here on the left, we've got the estimated median home value for Nevada County. And this goes through May. Right, the red line is California, so statewide median home values were about $580,000. Right, in Nevada County, home values are about $474 million. If we go over here and we look at San Francisco, right, we're talking 1.4 million versus the 474,000. Right, so about 3 times higher in San Francisco than in Nevada County, right? So you take that difference in home value and you add in the fact that a lot of tech companies are going to be telecommuting. And, I think that we're in a little bit of a telecommuting honeymoon where, the tech CEOs are saying, yeah, go away. You don't ever have to come into the office. I don't think that's going to last. So I think, honestly, the smart play for tech workers who want to get out of the Bay Area, who want to buy a house, who don't want to pay a fortune for a house, could look to Nevada County as a very attractive place to go. Very attractive for several reasons. One of which is that home prices are reasonable. I'm from the Midwest, so I still struggle when I say that 474,000 is reasonable. But at any rate, home prices are reasonable. There is an enormous amount of recreation. You can get out, you can hike, you can mountain bike, you can ski. It's endless, right? And at the same time, if your boss does say that she'd like to see you back in the office, you can get in your car in San Francisco. It's not a fun day trip, but it's easily done as a day trip, right? So it's not Montana, it's not Wyoming, where I've heard stories that, a lot of tech sector workers are moving out of state. And I worry that they're going to regret that decision because at some level, the tech companies are going to go, well, we thought telecommuting was better than it actually is, and we really would like to see you in the office from time to time. I think Nevada County could have a nice niche in there and build a little tech hub. And if it can do that, then it's going to have much more reliable source of revenue. It's going to be a much more stable economy, making lemons out of lemonade, right? Telecommuting may be Nevada County's silver bullet. Many tech companies indicated a reliance on telecommuting, but I think we're in a honeymoon and that's going to change. They'll want their employees coming back to the office, right? Nevada County has all sorts of appeal to it. Brings disposable, again, importantly, relatively stable income. Now, I'm not for a minute saying that this will be easy. Home prices will go up. It's going to crowd up some of the native population. I know you've already got issues with Airbnb doing the same thing, so it's going to take a lot of planning. It's going to take a lot of broadband investment, which is going to be hard to do. But there is a little pot of gold at the end of this rainbow if it's pursued correctly and well. All right, so I'll conclude and take questions for as long as you like. Right, this is a health crisis with enormous economic implications. It's got enormous built-in inequities, right? The haves and have-nots. There's a pretty growing literature now that says that, you know, it's pretty normal for the levels of inequality to increase on the other side of a pandemic. Those who are rich get richer, and those who are poor get poorer. And this is unlikely to be any different, right? GDP likely to contract between 6 and 9% this year. You know, if you ask me back in a month, I might be saying it's between 7 and 10%, or if things get dramatically better, hopefully I say it's lower numbers. Positive growth is back in 2021. I think that we're reopening tragically too soon. Not enough mask wearing. And this is going to impose enormous costs, both in terms of loss of life and the economy. Right, Nevada County, right, in the short run, struggle enormously. How to deal with it? There are 3 ways of dealing with it, really. One way is to borrow from the Federal Reserve, but that puts you in difficulty later on because you've got that debt. It means your interest rates are going to be higher later on. You're going to have to raise taxes, or you're going to have to cut services. It's going to be extremely difficult. I don't think Nevada County, except maybe in terms of severity, is very different from much of any other location in those terms. Right. Okay, so that's what I have. I'd like to end on a better note, but it's very difficult times, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you so much. Could you please elaborate on how do you predict the trend of the urban flight impacting Nevada County specifically? So which industries will benefit from the potential growth in population, and what type of amenities do you think these new native telecommuters are looking for, and how can Nevada County capitalize on this from a sustainable economic development perspective?
Yeah,
while of course balancing the need of the existing residents.
Right. So there's an enormous amount of planning that has to happen before this is really aggressively pursued, or while this is being aggressively pursued, because it's going to take a while for a lot of people to come up. Right. So what kinds of services? I think that they're going to want all kinds of services. It will broaden the base of the Nevada County economy significantly, because they're going to want coffee shops. They're going to want more grocery stores. They're going to want more hardware stores. They're going to want more of everything that we all need in our daily life. You know, increasing demand for all parts of the sectors and reducing the emphasis on tourism. You know, and they're going to be the same to some extent as the tourists who come in. So there's going to be, you know, increasing demand for some of those tourism system services as well. You know, a good place to live or to build a home, that's what they're going to want. They're going to want good access to the internet. So widespread broadband in the county is going to be very important.
I can co-sign that.
I want to point out that I know that is super easy to say and very hard to accomplish. But there is a pot of gold that can be gone after here.
I believe you will get no argument from anyone that broadband is an issue and it is incredibly important. So I have a question. How will the schools, with schools being at least hybrid for distance learning, how is that going to impact work and also economic recovery, as people will have to, the workforce will have to change either jobs because somebody needs to stay home with the kids if there is this part-time distance learning?
Yeah, I mean, there is no question that the nature, well, I think there is some question, the president would certainly disagree with me, but I think that ultimately schools will not be able to open business as usual in the fall. And that will be a drag on the economy, which, you know, I think is probably why the president wants everybody to go back to normal with respect to education, so people can go back to work. But it is going to be a drain. Some people will have to work part-time where they might be needed full-time. Some people will have to change jobs, so there won't be labor available for some other parts of the economy. yeah, the education is not only going to be bad for the kids long term, but it's going to, well, short term, but it's going to be bad for the economy in the short term as well.
And I believe you mentioned it. Could you repeat the website where people, there is a high demand for your PowerPoint. So, and I believe it's going to be on your website.
Yes, it's on my website, and there's a presentations tab on my website. You can see right behind me is the National Economic Education Delegation, and if you put that into Google, I'm pretty sure that it's the only thing that pops up. The URL is more unwieldy than I'd like it to be, but need.org was taken. Yeah, and I'm hoping that we can put a recording of this webinar
Absolutely.
up on my website as well.
Absolutely, the YouTube recording will be available 2 hours after we conclude, so no problem.
Terrific.
And in relation to the cost-benefit analysis, should Nevada County and the cities and towns reconsider how fast they move through the stages of reopening the economy?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. You know, as I mentioned when I was speaking, the recommendation is that you not move towards reopening until you have 14 days of declines in COVID cases. Nevada County doesn't have that. Most of the country does not have that. So we need to be putting on our masks. We need to be keeping our distance from people. We need to not have weekend barbecues. We need to, you know, I think stay out of bars, because bars are intended to bring people together. And that's not what we should be doing now. We should be going much more slowly. It's a pity that politics is playing such a big role here. This is not a political event. The coronavirus is not political at all. I realize that shutting down the economy is difficult politically, but saving lives or allowing people to die who don't need to, that should be equally damaging politically.
In your opinion, can you name any communities that have successfully pivoted and have best practices, demonstrated best practices for this, well, what is also called now the new normal?
Yeah, I can't, as an economist and not a virologist, I haven't been following that closely. My understanding that was New York City was doing very, very well in dealing with it. And they started to reopen. So there are some states that are showing downward trends, but I apologize. I don't remember just off my head which states those were.
And how does a rural county like Nevada County that has about 60% of multi-generational poverty even begin to offer new skill sets, new telecommuting opportunities? Should there be county-sponsored or collaborative trainings available in the county for recent grads, furloughed people, teachers to actually receive skill? What does your cost-benefit analysis say there?
Well, in a perfect world, I would say absolutely. Now is, you know, the perfect time to train people. You can't train them on site someplace, but you can do it through Zoom. But you know, that requires resources. You've got to hire the trainers. You know, on the upside, there are lots of trainers who are available these days, and they're available electronically. And in a perfect world, yes, that would be great. But given the financial situation of the county, that might be extremely difficult.
So that's something that we hope that the county and the cities are still with us and that they are listening. So to get more training, and you know, right now the Sierra College, the Grass Valley campus, will not be reopening for in-person education. So there might be some very well-distanced social distancing classrooms available, but we'll have to see.
Yeah, and that's clearly second best. So it's really unfortunate. You know, in-person teaching, I taught for 7 years, and you know, as a teacher, it's so hard to know how well your audience is absorbing what you're saying, right? For instance, tonight, Pascal, you're the only person that I can see. I don't know if people are wondering, what did you just say? How can I clarify? And all that sort of thing is just so much more difficult done electronically relative to in person.
It is way more difficult, and for now I believe that I'm looking at the number of participants, and from experience with various town halls, people are captivated. So there is no big drop off rate. So if that's helpful at all. For now, I see. Is there a is there a statewide, nationwide, or global demand for plexiglass? And if so, um, uh, if industries and institutions have implemented plexiglass shields, are we seeing more financially stable businesses? And is that a cheap and effective solution?
So I think it's a cheap solution. I don't know if it's effective. My guess is that it is. When I listen to the experts, they talk about, if you're in a closed space like a store, you speak and there's this cloud of particles that comes out. And if you've got a big wall of plexiglass in front of you, it's not going to make it much further away than that. And that is undoubtedly helpful. But there are a wide variety of companies that are benefiting significantly. My pet policy response in this is an excess profits tax, right? Those companies that are benefiting enormously from this, let's tax some of that and give that money to those who are in need. It's not offensive, but it doesn't seem quite right that companies ought to be making enormous profits off of other people's ills. And we should be, just from a societal perspective, maybe spread that around a little bit.
And speaking of companies making enormous profits, so big online e-commerce stores and like Amazon are crushing right now the mom and pop stores, and the challenges are getting worse and worse for the small business owners. Do you have any thoughts on what small businesses can do to pivot? Selling online is clearly a good move, but are there other suggestions you can give to local businesses? And that question, by the way, comes from Robert Trent, the executive director of Sierra Commons, who is teaching Igniter courses to actually take brick and mortar stores and bring them online. So I'm pretty sure that Robert has some ulterior motives here.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of them will have two options. One is pivot and go online, and the other is to just liquidate and call it a day. Because there's this day of reckoning has been coming for brick and mortar. It's been hastened by the coronavirus. A lot of these brick and mortars were going to go under. Amazon is stealing an ever greater market share. I applaud those small businesses who pivot and go online. I think it's worth a try. But at the same time, I think it's a tough road to hoe. Amazon is just so darn easy. So I feel enormously, and I will miss brick and mortar stores. But I don't know of a silver bullet. I simply don't.
And can you talk a little bit about the future of global supply chains and actually reshoring? Is there any chance that we will see a domestic manufacturing, a rebirth of domestic manufacturing, or is that just wishful thinking?
Well, I think there's probably about a 5-year window. And in that window, we'll see some reshoring, and we'll see a fair amount of diversification away from China. At the end of that 5-year window, we have short memories, and most companies are looking for the bottom line, and somebody's going to walk in the CEO's office again and say, hey, if we took this to China, we could save a bunch of money. And so it wouldn't surprise me at all if we've got a little window, 5 years, maybe 7. But in 10 years' time, it wouldn't surprise me if global supply chains were back to something akin to what they were like in the early part of this year. I think that's unfortunate. I don't think it's a good idea. It's not a good outcome, because this is surely going to happen again. But this is the way that we tend to conduct business.
What is your sense of commercial property collapse on the effect of commercial property collapse just on the local economy? Because of course we see empty storefronts, office buildings, etc. What's your sense there?
Yeah, no, I think that that's going to be really bad news from top to bottom. From the companies that can't pay their rent, that are causing the landlords to not be able to pay their mortgage, to the banks who aren't getting the mortgage payment, to the local government, which isn't getting tax revenue from those businesses. It's going to be extremely difficult. I'm gonna throw a rosy spin on it. I give WeWork a call. If WeWork a call, and they're not doing very well, but maybe somebody other than WeWork. But turn a lot of those space, get tech sector workers up here, and maybe turn those places into places where they might work communally. But that's going to be a big source of difficulty. I think residential real estate markets are probably going to do okay, but commercial, there's going to be this big divot. Hopefully they'll bounce back relatively quickly, but there'll be this big divot in revenues in foreclosures of commercial properties as well.
And a very Nevada County topic. Can you comment on cannabis industry? The cannabis industry as an economic driver for recovery, because it does exist here. I confess I'm not that familiar with the cannabis industry statewide or in Nevada County, but it's an agricultural product, and if there's lots of good land to grow it, and there's probably going to be more commercial space in which to package it. The market for it, my guess is, this is a complete guess, is that during this, the market may have gone up a little bit. People trying to find a slightly altered reality. So that might be a reasonable place to look for a little bit of a boost. And well, of course, coming back to broadband, that's a very popular topic. Should we assume that the rural counties that might benefit from urban worker dispersal are always those that have relatively good broadband access? In other words, what's the prognosis for our more rural neighbors that are less integrated with a larger economy versus via broadband?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that the tech workers are going to want to know that they can get connected. If they can't get connected, then their job is going to be at risk. If they can't perform at the same level they did when they were, or near the same level they did when they were on site, their job will be at risk. So I think the smart tech workers are going to look for where broadband is readily available, right? And part of that might be for Nevada County to call AT&T, Verizon, and everybody else and say, hey, we're going to have a bunch more customers for you. You help us out in terms of capacity.
I believe you gave just a lot of people an idea to contact their respective supervisors and council persons.
Yeah.
So we're going back to brick and mortar in a historic rural community that depends on tourism is, of course, very different from national. Can you reflect on the more experiential aspects of tourism and downtown character, and maybe basically they're asking for some optimism for a small rural downtown to survive. So do you see, where is the silver lining?
Oh, so when this is over, if Nevada County has managed to attract a bunch of tech workers, the downtown community will be more consistently vibrant, right? Tourism ebbs and flows, right? I used to go up to Lake Tahoe, the weekend before Memorial Day and the weekend after Labor Day, right? Because everything's still open, but nobody's there. And I would anticipate that, if the lemonade that I've been talking about can come to fruition, there will be lots more opportunity, lots more stable opportunity in the downtown areas for Truckee and other parts of Nevada County. And
back to the reality check about retail storefronts, it's really hard to pivot those. So again, a silver bullet for the retail storefronts, be they downtown or a little further out.
Right. So the lemonade will be helpful to the retail stores that manage to struggle through. But you might see a lot of what now are retail storefronts being turned into service storefronts, right? More coffee shops, more restaurants. more things that cater to, a group of folks, right? And my understanding is Nevada County has a dearth of people in the 25 to 44 age range, right? And I think that's precisely the age range of the tech workers that will come up to Nevada County. They'll come up and they'll have pretty good disposable income for lots of services. I think they'll probably be good online shoppers, so I'm not sure about the brick and mortar retail. But services, yeah, it might be a changing complexion of the brick and mortar storefronts in Truckee.
And maybe some of the towns will have to rethink certain restrictions that were put on some years ago, where it had to be retail, not just service. So it had to be retail absolutely for the downtown areas. And so that is something. So can you touch on influence of getting adapting zoning and regulations to this new economy if we are to have a chance?
Right. I mean, if this lemonade is to be pursued, then I think that there has to be a big step back from current zoning regulations, right? I'm not that familiar with zoning patterns in Nevada County, but a lot of thought and a lot of expertise, and that's not pushing my own services because it's probably not me, but a lot of expertise in what this kind of a clientele or citizenry is going to want, and how do you provide that in ways that are consistent with the historical look and feel of the town, right? How do you accommodate the new growth without sacrificing the heart and soul of the community? And I think that can be done. I'm not for a second saying it's easy. It's not, but I think that it can be done.
And I am looking at the list here, and we have caught up with all the original questions. So good. I think we have one more question, which is also for Nevada County very important, is where do you see the role of the arts in the financial forecast? And separately, are there county or city actions that could be taken to improve the financial outlook for Black, Indigenous, and people of color in terms of home ownership and jobs, keeping in mind that Nevada County is the, I believe, second whitest county in California?
Right. So in terms of the arts, if I were planning for an influx of tech workers, I would think very carefully about the arts and how to maintain that, because I think it's an important part of many communities in Nevada County. In terms of of dealing with the racial disparities, I'm not familiar with how bad they are in Nevada County, but I think statewide, nationwide, I think that we need to take a step back. Take a look at the situation, take a look at the history that has brought us to today, and think about policies that will rectify that. I don't think there's any silver bullet. Just enhancing access to education, that's been shown not to do it. Expanding access to home ownership, that doesn't do it without providing underlying wealth. It seems to be an issue of underlying wealth. And we've had a couple of hundred years of policy that have been designed to deprive minorities of access to wealth generating situations. And we need to think hard about policies that will change that. Not only to make things equal, but to make things equitable over the long term.
And we all expect this recovery to be uneven, be that by sector, be that by urban, rural. If you for a minute look into your crystal ball and say which areas will recover faster, and what would be the differentiating pivotal factors in a faster recovery?
Yeah, well, I think I mentioned earlier that it's going to be areas that have historical patterns of producing essential services that are going to come back fastest. because you know a lot of those services have maintained their status in the economy, but those are going to be the sectors of the economy that grow most quickly. You know, grocery certainly among them, hardware stores among them, things that are not optional. I know that this is not. I'm not catering to my audience here because that doesn't describe Nevada County, but I do think that those are going to be areas that are going to come back more quickly. It's also going to be areas that get the coronavirus under control the most quickly, that are going to have the most opportunity sooner. And you know, I know I've said it a couple of times. I'm on a little bit of a kick about masks. You know, I understand that a lot of people think from a freedom perspective, well, I've got the right to go around without a mask. Well, you know, that's debatable. But even if you do have the right to do it, if you have the right to do something, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a good idea. Right? And so even our founding fathers would have suggested that you know, a little bit of discretion is probably in order, even if you have rights.
And I believe this is a great point, and we can in time where we can stop, and we can thank you very much for being here, for your expertise, and for sharing it with Nevada County. And again, everything will be available. The whole webinar will be up on YouTube, and so will the presentation, and we'll try and make it easy and put a link to your presentation and to your website in the description of the video. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for your time, and thank you to County of Nevada, Grass Valley, City of Grass Valley, City of Nevada City, Town of Truckee, Sierra Business Council, and the Economic Resource Council for bringing you to Nevada County, albeit virtually. And hopefully, if we all wear masks, wash our hands, and be social distancing at some point, maybe we can meet in person.
That'd be wonderful. And let me say thank you for inviting me to be here tonight. I've enjoyed it. And I would be more than happy to come back at some point in the future and give an update or talk on some other topics. If I may, I am the executive director of a nonprofit, so I'm sort of quasi legally obligated to say that if you enjoyed the talk tonight and you make it to our website, there is a big blue donate button in the upper right-hand corner of our website. And there is no such thing as a donation that's either too small or too big. Thanks again for having me. I've enjoyed it very much.
Thank you. And with that, good night, everybody. Stay safe.